Okay, thank you for being here. Our topic for today is called specification by example. This is a pretty exciting technique for me to talk about because I think it's one of the keys to achieve agility because it bridges the communication gap between the business people and developers. You may have uh, heard about other type of names for this technique, like behavior-driven development, acceptance test-driven development, or in stream programming, they call it customer tests. So let's remember that agile software development can be seen in from 3 points of view: collaboration, technical excellence, and planning. And I think that specification by example is a technique that deals with the three of them. We'll see in a minute that it helps collaboration because it helps developers to speak better with the business and with the business to explain better their rules with developers. It helps us to automate a lot of tests and business logic, so it helps with the technical excellence part. And it helps with the planning because it leads developers to a better understanding of the requirements so that they can plan their tasks in a better way and do that in less time. So why? We may ask some questions here. How can we reduce misunderstandings between developers and the business? And also, how can we code complex business logic with fewer defects? So those are two big questions, right? And there are two great books on this topic. They are from the same author. His name is Kotko Akcik. He's an European engineer, and he has these two great books. Specification by Example is the newest one. And a few years ago, he wrote this other book called Bridging the Communication Gap, related to the same topic. So specification by example, it's about giving our team some guidelines on how to specify the requirements together. So we may see a tester, a developer, a domain expert, and a product owner, all of them around the same specification, sharing the same knowledge, the same context. And then, given that specification, they may ask what if scenarios and complete that specification with concrete examples. And if we are very disciplined, then we will be able to automate those examples without changing the format, maintaining the readability for the business and for developers in the future. So the first idea is that it's better to specify requirements with examples, with concrete data. And it's better than just giving formulas to developers or just giving some ambiguous textual explanation. So for example here, we got a requirement that is called facial value. And facial value, as you see here, is calculated with this formula. As we read here, even though formulas are not ambiguous, we may use examples to explain data types, expected decimal points, roundings. And here in this table, we got 3 examples. Each row here is an example that is called, for example, here 316 factor. Given this net worth and this net rate and this term and this calculus factor, then this example is giving us the expected facial value. So as we got here our inputs in this part and the outputs here, This will lead to more questions from the people. What if some of that data is negative or is zero, and we may complete the examples together, the testers and developers and the business person, in order to get a better understanding of the requirements. Okay, in Agile, usually people think that we don't do documentation, right? Because in the Agile Manifesto we say that we prefer working software over comprehensive documentation. So people think that we never document, and that's not true, because documentation is always valuable, especially for maintainability purposes. And the principle behind that is that we change some kind of documentation with tests and automated tests. And that is the reason that we speak a lot about test-driven development and unit testing and these kind of practices that put tests first. This practice is very important in a team because those examples, those tables of examples we are speaking about, are the key to designing software in a way that it can be automated. And if we speak about tools, we may just start using a whiteboard or an Excel sheet and trying to start with the formula, with the basic explanation from the business. Usually we just get, okay, this is the formula for the facial value. And then we may ask, okay, which are the inputs and which are the expected outputs? We may start with these 3 examples, and then we may go to a meeting and try to get the other players to ask more scenarios and get more examples, more rows, just to be more clear. And there are some interesting tools also. Okay, if you want to start, just start with a whiteboard and Excel. But here, Cucumber, Concordian, and SpecFlow are samples of tools that will help us to transform, to convert that Excel into an executable test, but keeping at the same time the same format. So it will be always very readable. This is the same example we were reading in the presentation. We got 3 examples, and those are in an HTML file that we got here. Sorry for that. Okay, so we got the same tables of examples, and here we're writing those examples in an HTML file. I will show them here in IntelliJ. This is an HTML file that has some keywords there, has some format. For example, here we got some tags and some code here that is expressed in some way that Concordian as a tool will take this HTML, execute it against my business logic, and then give us the results of those 3 tests. Just for the demo, let's execute these tests. They will run as unit tests, with the difference that they are running from an HTML file. And after we run the tests, we get a similar HTML file that gives us here the assertion that the 3 tests are successful. Let's just imagine the possibilities. Imagine that you got a complex, for example, investments or mutual funds system. You got a lot of business rules and formulas and decisions, a lot of business logic. And in 3 years, you need to do some maintenance to that system. If you got the documentation of your system in this format, then you may come to the specification and say, for example, what happens if the net worth is not this one, but I substitute that for an 8? Or you may think of another scenario, right? You may execute again all your tests, and you will get an answer for the system itself stating which is the expected behavior. Let's reload this, and here it's saying, very readable, very clear. I expected this number, 95, and I got this other one. In that sense, the business itself could ask you questions, and you can get answers very clear, and just send this same page to them and tell them, hey, this is the behavior of your system right now. Do you want to modify that rule? Yes, maybe not. Okay. The important part is that this kind of documentation will always be up to date. And that is something that we are always striving for in our systems, right? Documentation is always hard to maintain, hard to read, and it's usually very different from the actual code behavior. So this is Concordium. What do you need to use Concordium? Well, you need to start having on your team the discipline of, when you find a hard to understand business rule, to express it maybe in Excel or in a whiteboard, and then transform that to this HTML format. And with these special keywords that are not that hard, then you get onto your business logic, and you store these HTML files together with your source code. Usually people ask, is it worth to invest in automation such like this? Because when you speak of automation, usually people think on automating the UI, right? Or on other type of tests that are more technical. And this kind of automation is directly focused at the business terms, business rules, business decisions, validations. So I would say, is it worth? Well, I would say yes, if your business supports creating that living documentation. Because honestly, it takes time to do this kind of analysis and automation. It's not that hard if you train your team, but the business should be the sponsor of this effort. And also, yes, if your design is testable and you focus on the business rules, my advice would be, don't do this kind of testing through the UI, because those tests will be very fragile and they will break very, very easy, and they will be slow, you know. And usually in the internet, when you find this kind of technique, they try to explain it from the UI perspective, and unless in my opinion, it's not cost effective. It's too costly to automate the UI. And another advice would be, okay, start with unit tests. You can use Concordium if you want, but that is like another level of maturity for a team. If we start specifying each requirement in Excel and in whiteboards, and then try to automate that rules in unit tests, they will be great from the beginning. So a small summary for this part. How to start? Start with examples of your business rules, your formulas, conversions, validations. Validate them with the testers, with other developers, with the business owners, and then automate unit tests. That way, you may start getting some kind of living documentation, and it's automated. And that is the most important part for saying that it's living. It will be always up to date. And we get to the Gherkin language. I don't know if you have heard of this term, Gherkin. It's a special syntax for specifying this kind of tables. and is required by some tools. I showed you a minute ago Concordium. It's not required in Concordium, but in other tools such as Cucumber or SpecFlow, that's the way to create the examples, and it helps a lot by being consistent with how you do your examples. Let me show you an example here. In Gherkin, we try to think on the scenarios. Think of each scenario as a method in your source code. Okay? Each of that methods have arguments that are their inputs, and they have a return value. That return value may be a scalar value like an integer or a string, a boolean, or it may be an object, a data structure, or that may be a list of data structures. Anyway, the important thing is that you got inputs and you got outputs. The Gherkin language allows us to use these three keywords: given, when, and then, to explain those examples, or acceptance criteria if you prefer. The given part explains the people, which are the objects or the data that exists in the context of this scenario. Think of it as, for example, if you need to do some calculation and you need to bring some data from the database or ask some information from a web service, then that information that you are bringing from there will be in the given part of the explanation. So for example here, given the next releases information for a selected project. Here we are dealing with a Scrum project that has releases and has cycles like sprints. And we get from the database that this project has 3 releases, like here. These are the 3 releases that project has recorded in this system. We can have this keyword "and" just to say, okay, there are different kinds of information that comes from external sources. So given these releases and the first cycle started on this date, okay? When, this is the other keyword. When explains the actual information that you get from the user. For example, the information that you are giving in this moment to your method. When we ask for the days without release for the cycle that ended on cycle end date, and here we are trying to explain that this is a variable that we will use later, but this is just a date. Then, and the then keyword explains the outputs. Then we get the days without release, and this is the output for the method that we are specifying right now. What else? In this table below, we got 4 examples. Remember that it's the same format as the other one. Each one of these rows, it's an example and it's a specific call to that method that we are specifying right now. So if we think of this scenario as a method, that means that our method receives a list of releases, because we got that in the given part. It receives also a cycle end date, and then it produces a number here, the days without release. This is the output. Okay, so that's Gherkin. And if you go to the internet and try to read about it, you may find that there are other keywords, but I would like to keep it simple. And it would be great if you teach this to your team and keep it that simple, just to start being consistent with how you are explaining the business rules. So let's recap. Given explains the context, whatever I get from the database to do my calculations or decisions. Then when is the actual call with the data that you just got, for example, from the user. And the then explains the format, that the format or the type of data that you are getting as your output. In this example of this Gherkin, we are receiving just a number for the output, but we may get to more complex cases where you got lists or objects or lists of objects, and it will be very useful if you get to those scenarios too. As we were speaking about a few minutes, the first guideline I would like to give to a team that starts trying to specify with example is automate them with unit tests. And this is the example that we got right here. Remember that we got 4 examples. The first one was called there are no releases. The second one, there is a release before. The other one is ignore other cycles. And the other one is there are 2 releases before. Here we are using a framework that is called Spock. It's written in Groovy and it's targeting a website that is developed in Java. Each of those methods that we got here are unit tests, and as they have a testable design, they run pretty fast, like you see here. The most important part is that it's still readable. Even though it's not an HTML or an Excel sheet, it's readable. The methods had the same name as the requirements, so that you can relay from the table and then get some traceability to the code of your unit tests. And each one of those unit tests should have the same data that we used in the table of examples. And as you can see, they share the same words, the same business terms. They have the same parameters that we specified in the tables. And the most important part, they are executable. They are pretty fast. You may get to this with other frameworks, of course, if you are in .NET with NUnit or MS Test, or in Java with JUnit or any other tool. The important thing is that we got this information from the table of examples that we specified together with the business. Okay, the summary. The idea is that if we introduce this kind of practices to our teams, we will reduce misunderstandings because we will be specifying together with the business and we will be using concrete examples. We will reduce defects because the tests will be assuring the quality of those algorithms. And we can be very consistent if we learn to use the Gherkin syntax. There are some great tools that we saw. SpecFlow, Concordion, Cucumber, but if you start with unit tests, you will have a great opportunity of learning and improving your process. These are some good references. For example, the first link is on a book that is called The Art of Agile Development, and in that page that we got in the first link, we got the customer test practice explanation. It's a very good explanation. And in the other links, SpecFlow, Cucumber, and Concordion, they also have good explanation for the techniques, specifically with those tools, but they share the same principles. If you like to read, you got those 3 great books there that will give you more context and how to introduce that techniques to your teams too. So, thanks for watching. If you got any feedback or if you want to comment, please drop me an email. You may also find me on Twitter or in LinkedIn. So, see you next time.